Okay, great. All right, Eric, awesome to have you here. And you're one of the most experienced people I know in the humanitarian stabilization sector. We've known each other for some time, and currently, head of operations at. It would be great if you take a minute just to kind of share with our audience what you do, maybe a bit about your background in the work of Bluemont.
Happy to. Yeah. Thanks for having me, Brian. So I'm the Vice President of Global Operations at Bluemont. And Bluemont is an organization that we work in a lot of different areas. Primarily, we work in conflict and post-conflict settings. And as you noted, we do a lot of, I think the majority of our portfolio at this point is sort of humanitarian response and stabilization work. So that sort of immediate post-humanitarian efforts to kind of transition communities from the humanitarian crisis to these more durable solutions, right? To these to building the resilience of communities to be able to kind of get back on their feet. So Bluemont in the past year, we work in a lot of different places. In the past year, I've got a little list. We've been in Afghanistan, Colombia, Iraq, Jordan, Pakistan, Syria. And then prior to that, we've recently been in Mali, Niger, Ethiopia, Yemen. So, really areas where they're all in sort of that crisis or post-crisis space, and we're supporting them to kind of move up that transition again from being a community in crisis that is receiving humanitarian support and really, unable to meet their own needs to these sort of durable, resilient communities that are able to kind of move forward on their own.
That's awesome. Appreciate you sharing that. I was wondering if we could just start for those that aren't in this sector, maybe you could speak at a high level to give kind of the 101 on how humanitarian assistance works. Who are the players in humanitarian assistance? What are their specific roles? And any key trends you're seeing in that sector?
Sure. Yeah. So in the HA, humanitarian assistance, we just go by HA. So in the, the sector essentially operates as in a couple different ways, right? I mean, it's not a thing to just say there's a humanitarian emergency, right? There's this sort of immediate crisis. There are these like prolonged crises as communities are struggling to get back on their feet. And so essentially humanitarian assistance it covers all the different aspects that communities might need for support. So that it's organized. You'll hear in the humanitarian space, you'll hear people talk about clusters a lot. So it's organized around the different clusters. So there's sort of water, sanitation, hygiene, there's health, education, there's, food and how people get food support. The food security cluster, there is this concept in humanitarian response called NFIs, non-food items. So it's like, what are the basic needs that people have that they sort of can't buy in a market because they don't have a job or because the market doesn't even function. So for example, blankets in the winter or cooking fuel or heating fuel or all sorts of different items that need to be distributed to communities. So, so each of these sort of cluster areas has a group of organizations working to support that area in each crisis. And then they are coordinated, kind of at a higher level. And so there's the response in these situations is actually quite coordinated often. Lots of different actors. The biggest actor in the space is obviously UNHCR, the United Nations, is that High Council for Refugees? I'm not sure if I got that exactly right. But they're the UN agency that works in a lot of these humanitarian response issues, particularly where there are refugees. So IDPs are refugees. And then the other UN agency is UN OCHA. I'm not even going to guess what that stands for. I don't remember, but the HA at the end is humanitarian assistance. So between UN OCHA and UNHCR, they're the huge player in coordinating these humanitarian responses. And then, there's a lot of different entities like Bluemont, sort of international NGOs that work to support in each of those clusters in each of those sectors. So that's kind of the general layout of how the international community kind of responds to a crisis. And again, and then the response in each of those areas kind of evolves, right? It's, in the immediate in the sort of immediate aftermath of the crisis, the response looks very different than prolonged humanitarian crises where 6, 7 years later, the conditions still haven't been created for people to sort of independently get back on their feet.
Appreciate that. I wanted to dig into some of the sectors that you mentioned and clusters. As you know, on Frontiers, we're the experts on expertise. That's what we really care about. That's what makes us tick. It would be interesting to hear kind of what expertise really matters within or across these clusters, and maybe how that evolves throughout the crisis to stabilization transition.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in the sense that every cluster is important, you know, every emergency sort of evolves in its own way. And so which clusters are the highest priority really depends on the context. But within every cluster, within every sort of sector in a humanitarian response, same thing in the stabilization side, sort of once you've moved from HA to stabilization,
Mhm.
which is again is sort of a transition we can talk about. There is a few key ingredients that help that ensure the response is successful, right? So the first one is, you know, being able to operate in these environments is not just about having the technical expertise in. So one of the clusters is shelter and settlements, right? So it's not just about having expertise in shelter and settlements, it's about having the ability to adapt effectively in contexts that are sort of wildly, they sort of fluctuate wildly, right? So the context on the ground, how things work can look very different one day to the next. And so having the ability as an organization to be incredibly adaptive and responsive, so understanding very closely what's happening on the ground on a sort of day to day, week to week, month to month basis, and then being adaptable as those things change, I think
Mhm.
is a critical component to a successful humanitarian
Mhm.
response. And I think, that's an area where, the humanitarian community does an incredible job and probably don't get enough credit for how effectively they adapt to context
Mhm.
and learn from what's working and
Mhm.
what's not working as the context changes. And then within that, that's the sort of sine qua non of humanitarian response, right? If you don't know what's happening on the ground and are adapting accordingly, you're not really doing anything. But then within each of those sectors, you need that expertise in that sector. So Bluemont does a lot of work in, just as an example, we do a lot of work in camp management, in food security, in shelter and settlements. And so in those spaces, we have teams of experts both here at our headquarters, but primarily on the ground. Again, local experts who understand the local context and can respond with local solutions, who are trained in those areas, who understand what the international best practices are, who understand what the international standards are around. So humanitarian response has a set of standards that actors are required to operate by in these responses. So it's kind of that balance of being able to respond in, being adaptive and being able to respond to context, and then also having the expertise and understanding what the standards are and how you adapt those standards to that
Mhm.
context.
A lot of questions about those standards as well. I don't know, is there a certification program? Is that like how do you get can I get certified in being a humanitarian responder in general, or is that really like
That's a
sector
good
specific?
question that I don't actually know the answer to. So the standards are pretty universal. They're called the sphere standards, and
Mhm.
they cover each of the different sort of cluster areas, and they really go into detail around what the expectations are in
Mhm.
terms of response. But there are likely certifications out there that I'm not aware of.
Mhm.
But that's a good question.
I'm really interested in the point around adaptability. So curious if there are certain types of professionals that thrive in this environment that are adaptability, certain skills and qualities of professionals that make them good at this type of work. Also, the second part question. Also interested in organizational structures and practices that organizations can adopt that make them more adaptable given the importance of this for successful outcomes.
Yeah. So on an individual side, yeah, right. I mean, when we are building teams locally to respond to these crises, we're looking for individuals who are comfortable operating in ambiguity, right? You don't always have all the information you want in order to be able to make a good decision. And critically, so it's interesting, right? It's a combination of being comfortable in ambiguity, in ambiguous contexts and in ambiguity, but it's also about not being afraid to still make decisions in those contexts. It's not a context where you can just wait to have more information and then make a decision, because oftentimes, again, as we've talked about, the context is moving rapidly. The needs are quite dire. We're talking about people who are, often in war zones, or, the immediate aftermath of a war, and they don't have the means to sort of meet their own basic human needs. And so, if you have people on the ground who aren't comfortable making decisions with limited information, you
Mhm.
know, you can't operate there. So we really need people who are sort of humble. They are open to knowing what they don't know, but even within that context, they're still willing to make a decision and move forward. And then if more information comes down the pipe later,
Mhm.
we can make new decisions. But I think that's a critical piece, is just understanding that, you can't have a week where you just don't get stuff done because people are dilly-dallying or indecisive around some critical issues. That's just not an option in these
Yeah.
contexts. So you need people who have a bias towards action, but again, are humble and admit that they don't know what they don't know, and again, are willing to learn from the context, right? I mean, you can feel like you have a good grasp of the situation on a Monday, but by Friday the situation looks totally different. And if you're sort of clinging to your priors about what you think you know about the context, now your response is sort of not being as effective as it could be. So I think that's what we look for in individuals. I think organizationally, it's very similar. Something we talk a lot about at Bluemont is the concept of psychological safety, right? Which is managers creating space for people to speak up with what's working, what's not working, or disagree with decisions or ideas that are not being afraid to disagree with decisions or ideas that are being discussed. And to us, that's critical to operating in these environments. And I think it's the foundation for what makes an organization successful in this space, because you can't be adaptive to the context if you're not open to hearing how things are changing. You can't be adaptive in your programming if you're not open to listening about, you know,
Mhm.
what's not working. And a lot of organizations, I mean, you can run around and tell people, oh, open door policy, speak up. But it's really about being deliberate in how you create the space for people to speak up and,
Mhm.
and have those conversations.
I think that's getting into kind of the second part of my question is what can organizations do to become more adaptable and agile in the humanitarian context? Sounds like one of the answers is creating space for psychological safety, which is non-intuitive for me, but that now that you've explained it, totally makes sense. Are there other strategies that organizations can use to become more adaptive? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think, again, a huge piece of this is how organizations kind of communicate internally, right? And so, you know, part of it is, again, there's an underlying foundation of psychological safety there, but maybe the distribution team and a humanitarian response, they're out and they're providing gas into to tents in a refugee camp, cooking gas. And while they're out there, they're seeing things that aren't working, but that aren't in their sector, right? And so I think organizationally creating a space where people speak up and talk to each other, and they communicate between sectors, and they communicate. I mean, we're talking about strictly within a humanitarian context right now, but even more broadly, I think something we see as a bigger challenge and that we work very hard on internally is, there are this transition from communities that are in the middle of a humanitarian crisis to that, like, more stable long term, that what we call the sort of stabilization programming, and making sure that there's really effective communication between those different groups, right? That the
Mhm.
people working in HA aren't just siloed and thinking about
Mhm.
HA, and the people working in stabilization aren't just
Mhm.
siloed and thinking about stabilization, that they're working together to sort of identify the needs of the community and how they can be filled appropriately, and how
Mhm.
communities are kind of managed through that transition. So
you brought up the topic of silos, which is, as you know, another topic near and dear to my heart. I'm always very curious about how silos exist, why they exist, and how they, and what role they play in work in different sectors. It'd be
Uh-huh.
interesting to hear from you, like how do they play out in the humanitarian sector and why they exist in the first place?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, on some level, I think I, I I think let's talk about not just within the humanitarian sector, but that kind of across the continuum of sort of humanitarian response to, stabilization programming to kind of
Mhm.
long-term resilience and development programming. I mean, that personally is where I see a lot of the siloing, right? So within the humanitarian sector, I think, you know, the shelter folks work quite well with the wash folks often, not always, but often, work well with the camp management folks, again, because we have that cluster framework and that coordinated response where everybody is sort of connected and working together and sharing information. But I think where you get more silos is when I think a good example where Bluemont spends a lot of time is in northeast Syria, right? So this is a sort of a protracted crisis. There are both humanitarian and stabilization actors and funders and donors in that space. And, it's more challenging to bridge that kind of gap than it is to bridge a gap with just within a humanitarian response. And I think
Mhm.
those silos come about for a number of reasons. I think, it's the way that um, aid agencies are organized, right? I mean, they build expertise in these specific areas, and so you literally have a Bureau of Humanitarian Response in USAID. You have stabilization expertise in USAID. Same thing in the State Department, and so on some level, there's like an organizational, like a structural piece. But where does that come from? I mean, I think ultimately it's interesting. It comes from two. I sort of have two ideas. One is it comes from a good place, right? I mean, assuming let's assume positive intent and that people are there's a need for all this different expertise. And so creating these divisions, these organizations that have this expertise that can advocate for that specific sector or area or issue that can build expertise in it. And so you know, are learning from different situations around the world and are able to sort of form best practices and then share best practices. I mean, I think there's a lot of value in that sort of in that silo existing because of the way it can build expertise and learn and
Mhm.
advocate.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I think they come from a good place. I just think what happens is they get reinforced in large part. I mean, not just within the US, but we work with funders from Germany, from France, from Denmark. We work with governments around the world. And a lot of those kind of areas of expertise get reinforced into silos because there's like it gets embedded in the funding. So, we work with the humanitarian group at the State Department and at USAID. And then we also work with stabilization actors in USAID and the State Department, all in the same geographies. And we have these interesting conversations with them. Again, it comes back to communication. We have these interesting conversations with them around these are the needs of the community, and they're kind of in that middle ground. And how can we all work together? Like, you guys really
Mhm.
want to work here, and the rest of you want to work
Mhm.
here, but the needs of the community are right here, right now. And so, how can we work together to find the funding and find the expertise to support them in the way they need? So,
Mhm.
again,
Mhm.
back to your initial question, I think they spring up from a good place. I think they get reinforced by the way the sort of by like statutorily by the way the funding is allocated and
Mhm.
earmarked and managed. And I think,
Mhm.
yeah, that's part of the challenge, right? It's part of the fun.
I guess just the last question. This has been super interesting. Any on the silos topic, like any strategies that in implementing partner or humanitarian assistance organization such as Bluemont can do to reconcile those silos? How are you? It sounds like you're often in a place where you're seeing both sides and different expertise pools. Are there constructive ways that or strategies you're using to bridge those silos?
Yeah. So I think we can think about it internally and externally. And internally, how we bridge those silos is just um, actually it's funny. There is internal, external, and the answer is the same, right? It's finding ways to communicate. It's finding ways to share information and share learning and being humble about the information you have and the learning you have, and asking other people to come in and look at it and think about it with you, right? So if you're an HA expert, but you're operating in an environment that's kind of in the transition between HA and stabilization,
Hmm.
it's me and my role encouraging them to say, it's not enough for me to look at this from my lens. Let's bring some of our stabilization experts in and have them look at it from their lens in order to best
Hmm.
respond to the needs of the community. That's what it comes down to at the end of the day.
Hmm.
And I think externally, it's the same thing. I think we have a lot of conversations. I personally have a lot of conversations with both the stabilization actors in the donors, as well as the humanitarian actors in the donor agencies, and helping them understand what the needs are on the other side and how the
Hmm.
other side is working, and how we
Hmm.
can kind of come together to support the needs of communities when they kind of, I don't want to say they fall through the cracks,
Hmm.
but when they don't fit very neatly into one bucket or
Hmm.
the other.
Um, I sorry, I promise this was my last question, but I'm interested because kind of what my learning from this conversation is how important communication is in the sector for bridging silos. But I also know you also talked about deep technical experts in specific areas as well. Have you found the need to, and maybe strategies for maybe imparting the communication skills on technical experts to make them more effective in that sector? Is that a is that a worthwhile pursuit? Can training be part of the answer? Because not everybody, communication is a skill, like
Yeah.
you, and it's, I believe, substantially learned. Is that something, that organization that Bluemont specializes in or tries to focus and encourage through training?
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly right. And I think it starts even before that. I mean, I think one of the things we talk about is trying to hire for humility, right? And if you're one of the world leading technical experts in something, I'm not the world leading technical expert in anything, so I don't know exactly what that looks like. But if you've spent your entire career going miles deep on a single topic, right? I mean, it's hard to remember that, like, there are other perspectives out there that might still be valuable for you to listen to, right? And so
Hmm.
one of the things that we really push with our, particularly with our technical experts, both at headquarters and in the field, is, you know man, your expertise is so incredibly valuable, but we want you to come to these conversations with humility and, like, trying to ask the questions to figure out what it is you don't yet know, or why it is your expertise that you've gleaned in some other setting might not operate in this context, right? So we actually do a lot of sort of some training and a lot of discussions, and just, kind of brown bag conversations around, how do you bring that mindset to a conversation? Like, what does curiosity look like when you're already a sort of a deep expert in something? And just challenging our teams to kind of stay curious and stay humble,
Hmm.
um and then the communication flows from there, right? So if you're
Right.
genuinely curious when you're entering a conversation, it's easier to enter with questions and get into an interesting
Hmm.
conversation than it is to come in and say, this is what I know, and I don't really want to hear about it.
Hmm. Once you've kind of succeeded at creating those communications channels, I'd imagine there's a kind of a secondary need of sharing that knowledge and then
Yeah.
capturing that knowledge. How does that
Yes.
play out in an organization like Bluemont? How do you, as an organization, learn, capture? What are the knowledge management needs to do this
Yeah.
effectively?
Well, I mean, that's always a work in progress. It's always something I wish we were doing better, but we do it quite well, I think. So our primary architecture for that is that we have what we call technical communities of practice. They're organized online, and they have, within each technical community of practice, we have sort of resource libraries, and then just we facilitate opportunities for experts on a certain subject to kind of talk and communicate. And so maybe one of our, I mean, I can actually give you an example. We have we are running in the sort of shelter space. We're running a really interesting impact evaluation on providing rent subsidies to refugees in Colombia to help them, find housing and get back on their feet and not have to worry about paying rent while they're trying to figure out how they're going to, you know, um, build livelihoods for themselves in this new setting where they've moved to, right? And we're learning some really interesting things on this impact evaluation about how rent subsidies work and how they don't work, and what the advantages and disadvantages of them are.
Mhm.
So we also are working with, returnees in Northeast Syria from some of the IDP camps, right? From the internally displaced persons camps. And so through the technical communities of practice, we've connected our sort of shelter and settlements people in Colombia who are working on a rent subsidy impact evaluation with some of our sort of, stabilization shelter people in
Mm,
Northeast Syria to try to learn from, like, hey, what are they doing over there? It might not translate directly, but like, how could we adapt that for this context? So we really use
mm,
these sort of global technical communities of practice to try to share this
mhm,
knowledge and make sure that, that our learning in one location is sort of shared in another, or that,
mm,
someone from Syria can ask questions about work that people are
mhm,
doing in Afghanistan to try to,
mhm.
just promote learning and ask questions. So
I mean, I'm in touch with several operations leaders that are similarly exploring communities of practice. Do you feel that you have kind of a playbook for that that's working? Any sort of tips on setting one up? Any
ooh,
limitations you see that need to be solved there? Is it a panacea for everything? I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
oh man, I would love for it to be a panacea for everything, but it's definitely not. I think I would say two things, right? So this is when you're setting up something like a community of practice, what you're really talking about is, sort of in a very underlying way, it's sort of changing people's behavior, right? So right now, prior to implementing a community of practice, I'm an engineer working in Northeast Syria. My behavior is essentially to focus on my project, to see, I have to know what's working there. I have to know what the local engineering standards are for whatever construction thing I'm working on. And it's a little bit insular, right? And the
Hmm.
idea of a technical community of practice is we want you to change your behavior around, where do you look for resources? How do
Hmm.
you engage with people to help get questions answered? How do you share what you're learning with other people? So those are actually changes in someone's behavior. And so
Hmm.
you think about this in a couple ways. One is you have to make it easy. I mean, nobody changes their behavior if behavior change is hard. Like that's, not in a work setting, not in a personal setting. So one of the things we worked very hard to do was to build an infrastructure. We used Microsoft Teams to essentially build an infrastructure where it's everyone in our organization already had access to Teams. It's very easy for them to get into their technical community of practice, to find the resources that are there, to connect with experts around the world. So part of it was just, ease of the infrastructure. And it was easy because Teams is already a communications platform that we use, so people didn't have to sort of learn a new platform, anything like that. So that was a big piece of it. The second piece of it, though, was so that was great, and I think that's what a lot of organizations do. They know the importance of having the platform, but it's, what is motivating people to then use the platform, right? So we've made it easy for them to use, but what are we doing? And so we actually have tasked some of our technical experts here at headquarters with energizing each of the different communities of practice. So their job is to sort of get in there every day, not every day, let's say once a week, and just say, hey, I had a really interesting meeting about, local governance structures in Colombia with the Colombia team the other day. I wanted to share some of that here, and, because it might be useful for you guys in Pakistan who are working on education governance, and just kind of constantly using it and driving people to it and asking
Hmm.
questions there to kind of to just motivate people into the space a little bit. So I think
Hmm.
those are the two things we did that have proven pretty effective. Again, it's not a panacea. I'd love for it to be more
Hmm.
effective, but it's change is slow and it takes time, but it's definitely a goal of ours.
But it sounds like when it does work, when you do get that behavior change, the impact is quite high. As the
Yeah.
example you shared of kind of sharing cross-disciplinary knowledge and combining that in new ways. How would you say in those community practices, like, for one of your, expertise areas, the what do you think the ratio is between the number of people that are engaged in that community and the potential people in your organization that have expertise to share?
Oh, that's a good question. So the sort of percentage of people that are active in the community relative to that whole community. Oh, it's probably not that high yet. I mean, it's effective and it's functioning and we're learning a lot through it. But if
Mhm.
I'm being realistic, engagement is probably something like 20 to 30% only still, which is amazing,
Mhm.
right? If you consider that a year ago we didn't have
If you're going from zero, yeah.
it was zero exactly. So I'm very happy with where we are. Um, but yeah, it's probably
Mhm.
not. It might even not be that high. I'm not entirely
Mhm.
sure, but
Mhm.
that's our goal. I mean, one of our sort of organizational priorities this year is to keep deepening the use and the value of the technical community as a practice.
Mhm. Mhm. Great. Super exciting. Well, we've covered a lot of ground. I've learned a lot. I really appreciate your time. Any last words or advice you'd like to share to other practitioners in the space? Feel free to comment. Anything else you think we all should know? But otherwise, just really want to thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. I really appreciate it. I'm not sure I have any other wise,
Parting words of wisdom.
final words of wisdom. But again, I just think, in these contexts, particularly with places where Bluemont works, being humble and admitting what you don't know on a daily basis goes a
Mhm.
long way. So I think
Yeah.
that's the driver to success in these contexts.